There are moments when discomfort becomes a statement. When the decision to opt out of something, to step back, to decline, to say, "Not me, I don't want to engage with this," carries more meaning than the person opting out intended it to carry, or perhaps exactly as much meaning as they intended, which is in some ways worse. This is a story about one of those moments. About a category on a game show, and what happened when the family at the right podium decided, audibly and visibly, that answering questions about it was not something they were prepared to do. About what that decision communicated to the family at the left podium, who were standing right there, and who heard the decision and understood it with the complete, immediate, practiced clarity of people who have been watching other people make decisions like this their entire lives. And about what Steve Harvey said, which was not a lecture and was not a reprimand and was not a speech, but which was something more specific and more useful than any of those things. It was an education, delivered with the directness and warmth of a man who has spent 30 years watching how people engage with each other and who knows, from that watching, exactly what is lost when people decide that someone else's culture is not worth knowing. Hit that like button and subscribe right now before we go any further, because this channel is here for exactly these stories, about the moments when discomfort reveals something, and about the people who respond to the revelation with grace and with truth, and we bring one every single week. Now let us talk about what happened in that studio and what the Hendersons showed everyone in the room. The Henderson family from Memphis, Tennessee arrived at the Family Feud studio in the summer of 2024 with the particular energy of a family that has decided to bring everything they have. The team captain was 49-year-old Marcus Henderson, who was a music producer who had spent 25 years working in the specific, particular ecosystem of Memphis music, the city that had produced blues and soul and gospel, and a strain of hip-hop that carried the DNA of all three, and whose sound had been shaping American music for longer than most people who listened to American music fully understood. He was not famous in the way that fame usually means. He was known in the rooms that mattered to the work, known by the musicians and engineers and studio owners and A&R people who populated the industry he had built his life inside, known as someone whose ear was accurate and whose instincts were trusted, and whose credits stretched back 25 years across a body of work that had touched more people than would ever know his name. His wife Gloria, 47, was a librarian at the Memphis Public Library System who had spent 19 years connecting people with books, and who had, in 19 years of doing this, developed the specific, comprehensive awareness of a person who has read widely, and who has helped thousands of other people find what they were looking for, and who therefore had an unusually broad and unusually accurate map of what human beings tended to want to know. Their son Darius, 23, was a graphic artist and DJ who had his father's musical intelligence and his mother's visual intelligence, and the specific, current fluency of a young man who was working in culture right now, in the present tense, and who therefore understood what the culture currently was in a way that even Marcus, who was 25 years in, sometimes had to ask about. Their daughter Amani, 20, was a Howard University sophomore studying communications, and had the focused, articulate energy of a young woman who has found the thing she is going to do with her life, and who is building the tools to do it. And the fifth team member was Marcus's mother, 72-year-old Nettie, who had grown up in Memphis in the 1950s and 1960s, and who had, in growing up there in that time, become a repository of experience and history and knowledge that her family treated as the resource it was. They were, in short, a family whose cultural knowledge was not abstract. It was professional, personal, lived, and multi-generational. Memphis was not a backdrop for the Hendersons. It was the material of their lives. The competing family was the Larson family from Des Moines, Iowa. The team captain was 46-year-old Doug Larson, who was a high school shop teacher with the practical, direct, amiable manner of someone who has spent his career teaching teenagers to build things with their hands and who approaches most situations the way you approach a construction problem, with pragmatism and without much embellishment. His wife Karen, 44, was a dental hygienist who was quick and warm and had the organized efficiency of someone whose professional life consisted of managing a constant flow of patients and information. Their son Tyler, 22, was working at his uncle's hardware store and was the most energetically competitive person in the family, the one who had done the most pre-game research and who had strong opinions about buzzer timing. Their daughter Ashley, 19, was in her first year of community college and had the slightly overwhelmed, genuinely delighted quality of someone who is in a completely new situation and is finding it much more interesting than she expected. And Corinne's brother Phil, 48, was a former college wrestler who had retired to running a small landscaping business, and who had the specific, amiable, competitive intensity of a man who had been athletic his entire life, and who channeled that athleticism into everything, including game shows. The pre-game introductions were warm in the unremarkable way. Both families came across well. Steve Harvey found the personalities and drew them out with his customary ease. The Larsons were charming and direct in the Midwestern way, and the Hendersons were warm and genuinely interesting in the way that families with real cultural depth tend to be interesting when you ask them about themselves. Steve spent a significant amount of time with Marcus, asked about the 25 years, about Memphis music, about the specific work of producing, about what it meant to work in a city with that musical history. Marcus talked about it with the easy, unpretentious authority of someone who has been doing something long enough that the knowledge of it is no longer impressive to them, but simply the water they swim in. Steve asked Nettie about growing up in Memphis. She told him one story from 1963, and the audience went completely quiet in the way that audiences go quiet when they understand that they are hearing something real that costs something to live through. The first round was standard. The second round was standard. The third round was when the category was revealed. The category was things associated with Black American cultural traditions. It was a survey category, the results of 100 people answering a question, scored by frequency, the same mechanics as every other category on the show. It was, for the Henderson family, approximately the easiest category that could possibly have appeared on the board. Marcus had spent 25 years working in one of those traditions professionally. Nettie had grown up inside several of them and had lived in Memphis through the musical and cultural movements that had shaped them. Gloria had read extensively about them. Darius lived inside the current iteration of them. Imani was studying communications precisely because she wanted to understand how culture moved and why it mattered. The Henderson family was going to answer this category the way a professional chef answers questions about food. The Larson family was going to have a different experience. The buzzer went to Marcus, which was not surprising. He gave an answer, the correct answer, confidently and quickly, and the board revealed it in the number 1 position. The Hendersons moved through their turns. Steve Harvey watched both sides of the stage with his customary attentiveness and noticed, during the Larson turns, something that he processed initially as nerves and then recategorized as something more specific than nerves. Doug Larson hit the buzzer for his turn. He looked at the category on the board. He looked at Steve Harvey. He said, and this was the moment, this was the thing that produced what followed, "I don't think I'm really the right person to answer this one." Steve Harvey said, "How come?" Doug said that he didn't know much about, he gestured toward the board, all of that. He said he didn't want to get it wrong or say something he shouldn't say. He said he didn't think it was really his place. He delivered these statements with the genuine, uncomfortable sincerity of a man who believed he was being respectful and who had not fully thought through what the man standing 6 feet to his left and the woman who had grown up in Memphis in the 1950s standing behind that man were hearing as he said them. Corinne nodded along. Tyler looked at the board with the expression of a young man whose competitive instincts were in direct conflict with his family's apparent decision and who was not sure which way to resolve the conflict. Ashley looked at the Henderson family and then at her father and then at the floor. Phil folded his arms. Steve Harvey was still. He had been in the room for what Doug Larson said, and he had been watching the Henderson family receive it, and he had been doing what he always did in moments like this, which was take the full measure of the situation before he responded to it. He looked at the Larson family. He looked at the Henderson family. He looked at Nettie, who had heard a version of this kind of withdrawal, this particular flavor of not my place, "I don't want to engage with this," across decades, and who had received the current version with the specific, contained patience of a woman who has seen 72 years of the world, and who has developed from that seeing a very large capacity for patience and a very clear understanding of what patience costs. Steve turned back to Doug. He said, "I want to make sure I understand what you mean. You said you don't think it's your place to answer questions about Black culture." Doug said that was right, that he didn't want to step out of line or say something offensive. Steve Harvey said, "Can I tell you something?" The assumption behind what you just said, the assumption that the right response to not knowing about someone else's culture is to opt out of engaging with it. That assumption is one of the things that produces the not knowing in the first place. Because if you never engage with it, if you always say not my place and step back, you never learn it. And if you never learn it, you always have to step back. He paused. And the people whose culture it is, he indicated the Henderson family, are standing right there watching you step back, and they know exactly what that stepping back means, and it does not feel like respect to them. Does it? He looked at Marcus. Marcus said quietly, "No." He looked at Nettie. She said with the particular, measured cadence of a 72-year-old woman who has been waiting patiently for the room to be ready for what she has to say. "It feels like our culture is something to walk around, something that people see and decide not to touch." The room was quiet. Doug Larson was quiet. Karen had the expression of a woman who is receiving something she had not expected to receive and who is deciding how to hold it. Steve Harvey said, "I don't think you meant harm. I think you thought you were being careful, but there's a version of careful that looks from the other side like avoidance. Like I see this thing and I would rather not engage with it. And when the thing is someone's history and someone's music and someone's way of being in the world, when the thing is a person's culture, not engaging isn't neutrality. It's a decision." He looked at both families. "The survey questions on this show are for everyone. They are about how human beings live, all human beings. All of us," he turned to the Larson family, "and I want to give you the chance to try because I think you can, and I think trying is worth more than stepping back." He looked at Doug Larson with the direct, warm, entirely non-punitive expression of a man who has said what needed to be said, and who is now doing something more useful than continuing to say it, which was offering the opportunity to try. Doug Larson was quiet for a moment. He looked at the Henderson family. He looked at Nettie specifically, and she looked back at him with the steady, patient attention of a woman who has nothing to prove and who is entirely willing to wait for a person to arrive at the right decision on their own time. Doug looked at the board. He said to Steve Harvey, "I'll try." Ashley, 19, first year of community college, still figuring out most things, said to nobody in particular but loudly enough to be heard, "That's the right answer, Dad." Steve Harvey pointed at Ashley. He said, "She's right." He looked at the board. He said, "Let's continue." What followed for the remainder of the category and for the 2 rounds that came after was a game that operated on the particular frequency of a room that has just done something difficult, and that is now on the other side of the difficulty, more alive than it was before. The Larson family tried. They were not accurate, particularly. Doug's answers reflected the specific, honest shape of his knowledge, which was limited in the particular way that the knowledge of someone who has never been required to engage with something is limited. Tyler, who had done the most pre-game research and who had a more current relationship with popular culture than his father, was better. Ashley, who was 19 and in college, and who had consequently been in more rooms with more people from more backgrounds than any of the rest of her family, was surprisingly good. Gave 2 answers in the category that hit the board, which she received with the visible satisfaction of a young woman who has just discovered that something she knew was useful. But the Henderson family was incandescent. Marcus was everything that 25 years of professional immersion in the material of the category could produce: fast, precise, given with the ease of someone playing on their home court, which in a very real sense he was. Gloria answered with the comprehensive accuracy of a librarian who had read widely and who had helped thousands of people find what they were looking for and who knew this territory as well as she knew any other. Darius brought the current, live, immediate knowledge of a young man who was working inside the culture right now. Imani brought the analytical intelligence of a communications student who had been studying exactly this: how culture worked, how it moved, what it meant. Nettie gave 3 answers across the remaining rounds that hit number 1, and number 2, delivered each one with the quiet certainty of a woman who did not learn what she knew from a survey or a classroom, but from having lived inside it for 72 years. After the 3rd one, Steve Harvey looked at Nettie for a long moment. He said, "Can I ask you something? Growing up in Memphis in the 60s, what do you want people to understand about what that was?" Nettie thought about it. Not for long. She had been thinking about it for 60 years. She said, "I want them to understand that it was beautiful, that even in the hardest parts of it, we were making something beautiful. The music, the food, the way we talked to each other, the way we took care of each other, it was beautiful. And I want people to know it was beautiful because they chose to know it, not because they had to." Steve Harvey received this with the still, full attention of a man who has been given something he is going to carry with him. He did not immediately say anything. The audience did not make any sound. Then he said, "That is what this game is for people to choose to know." The Henderson family won the main game. They went a fast money with Imani going first. She scored 115 points with the clear, organized accuracy of a communications student who understood how survey respondents thought, and who had been studying that understanding for 2 years, and who was applying it now with the specific satisfaction of seeing her academic work produce a practical result. Marcus went second. He stood at the fast money podium the way he stood in a recording studio, with the complete settled presence of someone who knows that the work in front of him is something he has been doing his whole life in various forms and who is not intimidated by the specific form it is taking today. Steve Harvey looked at him across the stage. He said, 25 years. Marcus said, Memphis. Steve Harvey said, that's everything. He hit the button. Marcus Henderson answered 5 Family Feud survey questions in 20 seconds with the comprehensive, grounded accuracy of a man whose professional life had been built on understanding what moved people and why. He knew music, which meant he knew what human beings responded to. He knew Memphis, which meant he knew the deepest root system of the music. He knew production, which meant he knew how to read what something needed and give it that thing without excess. 4 of his 5 answers were number 1. The 5th answer, the last question, the one that arrived with 3 seconds left, was number 2 by 4 responses, and he gave it with the complete confidence of someone who has learned not to second guess the first answer the brain produces, which was the most important thing 25 years in a recording studio had taught him. The Henderson family's combined fast money total was 298 points. They had won $20,000. The audience gave them the response that follows something that was more than a game. The response of people who had been somewhere together and who were expressing, in the only way available to them, what it had felt like to be there. Steve Harvey brought the check to the Henderson family and stood in front of Nettie first, because the afternoon had been oriented toward her in a way that the room had felt, and because placing the check in her hands first was the room's way of acknowledging what she had said about beauty and what it meant to choose to know. Nettie held the check. She looked at it. She looked at her family. She looked at the Larson family across the stage, where Ashley was applauding and Tyler was applauding and Doug and Corinne were applauding in the earnest, slightly humbled way of people who have received something they had not expected to receive and who are not sure yet what they are going to do with it but who know it was important. She looked at Steve Harvey. She said, you tell people to come out here and show the world who they are. She held up the check. This is who we are, Steve Harvey said. I know, I saw it. The episode aired 6 weeks later. The clip of Steve Harvey's response to Doug's opt-out, the specific distinction between careful and avoidance, the direct naming of what stepping back communicated to the people it was stepped back from, the invitation to try, spread through educational communities and diversity training programs, and the broader, persistent conversation about what it meant to engage with cultures other than one's own. Teachers used it in classrooms. Trainers used it in corporate settings. It was cited in conversations about the difference between tolerance, the passive acceptance of something's existence, and engagement, the active choice to know something, to learn it, to extend yourself toward it. Nettie's line about beauty was quoted separately and frequently. We were making something beautiful, and I want people to know it was beautiful because they chose to know it. Doug Larson watched the episode with his family. He did not make a public statement. His daughter Ashley posted a brief reflection. She was 19 and still figuring out most things, and her reflection showed this honestly, which was part of what made it resonate about what her father had said, and what Steve Harvey had said, and what it had felt like to be in the room when both things were said. She wrote that she had not known before that afternoon that not engaging with something could be its own kind of message. She wrote that she had been thinking about this since, about the things she did not engage with and why, and what that communicated and to whom. She wrote that she did not have answers yet. She wrote that she thought having the question was a start. Tyler Larson, 22, who had done the most pre-game research and who had answered more of the category questions than any other member of his family, sat with his uncle Phil after the broadcast and talked about it in the direct, practical way of 2 men who were better at doing things than describing things, but who were trying to describe something. Tyler said he had known some of the answers because he listened to a lot of music and had never thought of that listening as learning something about culture. He said he was going to listen differently now. Phil said he did not know if that was the right thing to say, but that it seemed like a reasonable start. Tyler said Phil's standard for a reasonable start was pretty low. Phil said that was fair and that Tyler could do better than a reasonable start if he wanted to. Marcus Henderson went back to Memphis and back to the studio and back to the music. He told the musicians he worked with about the taping, about the category, about the opt-out, about Steve Harvey's response, about Nettie's line. He told it the way he told stories about music, which was with attention to what was produced and why, what the moment generated and what it left behind. One of the musicians, a guitarist who had been working with Marcus for 12 years and who had the quiet, observational intelligence of a person who spent most of their professional life listening, said that what Nettie had said was a lyric. He said it had the structure of a lyric, the compression of something large into something small, the way a good song line carries more than it looks like it can carry. Marcus said that Nettie had always been a lyric. He said some people just were. He said his mother had been making lyrics his entire life. He had just been lucky enough to grow up listening. Nettie went home to Memphis. She went to her church the following Sunday, as she always did, and she told the story to the women she sat with in the second pew from the left, where she had sat for 40 years. She told it the way she told most things, without drama, with the particular attention to specific detail that people develop when they have been paying careful attention to the world for a long time and have learned that the specific details are always the most important part. She told them what the young man from Iowa had said, and what Steve Harvey had said, and what she had said. The woman beside her, who had been sitting in the second pew from the left for longer than Nettie had, said, "What you said about choosing to know, that was the thing. That was the whole thing." Nettie said she knew. She said she had been waiting a long time to say it somewhere that people would hear it. She said she thought they heard it. They had. 40-some-odd million of them, across the weeks that followed, had heard a 72-year-old woman from Memphis say that her culture was beautiful, and that she wanted people to know it was beautiful because they chose to know it, not because they had to. They had heard Steve Harvey say that not engaging was not neutrality but a decision, and that the people whose culture was being stepped around were standing right there and could see the stepping and understood what it meant. They had heard Doug Larson say, "I'll try," which was a small thing and a real thing, and sometimes the distance between those two categories is smaller than it looks. They had heard Ashley say, "That's the right answer, Dad," in the voice of a 19-year-old who was still figuring out most things, but who had just figured out this one thing correctly, on the right side of it, in a room where it mattered. Culture is not a category on a game show. It is the accumulated everything of a people, the music and the food and the language and the memory, and the way of moving through the world that a group of human beings has built and refined and passed forward over generations. And that is still being built and refined and passed forward right now, today, in every city where people are creating things and calling to each other and making something beautiful out of the specific circumstances they find themselves in. It belongs to the people who made it. It also belongs, in the sense that anything can belong to someone by virtue of choosing to know it, choosing to love it, choosing to extend themselves toward it with the genuine curiosity that is the basic prerequisite for actually understanding another human being, to anyone who chooses it. That choosing is not extraction. It is not appropriation. It is not performance. It is the simple, fundamental, often underrated act of deciding that someone else's experience is worth knowing, that their history is worth understanding, that their music is worth listening to not as background but as something that came from somewhere, and that says something that you do not yet know but could. Steve Harvey said it simply, trying is worth more than stepping back. The Henderson family had been making the argument with their lives for decades. Nettie made it again in 6 words in a game show studio for 40 million people. We were making something beautiful. Choose to know it was beautiful. That is the invitation. It has always been the invitation. What you do with it is up to you. If this story reached you, if Nettie's words landed somewhere real, or if this helped you see the difference between careful and avoidance in your own life, share this today with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below and tell us what part of this story you are carrying with you, because this community pays attention to each other and every voice here matters. And if you are not already with us, subscribe right now, because every single week we come back with stories exactly like this one. Stories about the choice to know. Stories about the culture that is still being made and still being passed forward and still waiting to be chosen. And stories about the women who sat in the second pew from the left for 40 years and who said, finally, in a room large enough to hold it, it was beautiful. It has always been beautiful. Choose to know. We will see you in the next one.